Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
Father, we're thankful for the life you've given to us to live and the mind you've given to us to think about that life and to think about its benefit, its outcome. You have revealed to us in your word what we need to know about where we came from, why we're here as human beings and as individuals, and where we're headed. I thank you, Father, for the Lord Jesus Christ, that He came into this world, a world which He had created, and He came and lived here as a human being like we, with a proper understanding of all things from an eternal perspective. And so as we look to Him, we can know what's valuable, what's important, and we can know truth. I pray that you'll help us to discipline our minds to think correctly under the teaching of your Holy Spirit, even as Paul instructed us. And I pray, Father, that you would help this class to be beneficial to us personally and beneficial to others, as we would help them be able to examine whether or not they have a true understanding of the makeup of the world and therefore a truthful approach to life. Direct our class time today, and I ask these things in Jesus' name for His honor and glory. Amen. Okay, we've come to this part in our lecture thinking about the nature of man, conceiving of the nature of man from the standpoint of secular humanism. And the basic tenet is that humanity is not created but evolved. And we've noted the difference, though, from naturalism in regard to how that's conceived. And the humanist is not going to follow the logical outcome of naturalism with regard to value and purpose of human living. And so we'll affirm that man is personal with freedom and self-consciousness. So personhood really comes from the fact that we're created by a personal God. Humanism jumps over that, says we can be evolved but still be persons, still have a higher sense than just what we would be as part of the mechanism, as part of the mindlessly evolved sequence of things. So this is, really we share this with secular humanists. We also believe that we are persons, that we do have freedom, that God has given us the dignity of making choices. We have self-consciousness. We can think about life. We can think philosophically. We can speculate. And so what's really happened here is that there has been a return to a view of humanity that is more in line with Christian theism, with Western man, modern man, non-theistic man, pulling back from naturalism. So this is an affirmation, and we need to take it seriously. What follows from that is that man is autonomous. Man is independent and free from authority or restraint. This is the point, remember, that Schaeffer makes as he develops where Renaissance humanism went. It went in that direction of man being autonomous, that is, completely free from any outside restraint. And of course, this is where we would differ from where humanism and theism would diverge. We do not feel we're autonomous, though we feel that humanity has dignity, that we can make choices, that we can accomplish, that we can act independently if we so desire. That is not our essential nature, and that is not what we are created to be. So we are not completely free from outside authority or restraint, though human beings in rebellion against God may act that way. So, but that is a subscription of secular humanism that is taken seriously and is of the essence of what being fully human is. And so we see that they affirm that. And then a critical juncture, a critical departure from Christian theism would be that man is basically good. This is what the secular humanist would say. Basically good and capable not only of great progress, but of ultimate perfection. You remember the opening scene of the movie Katie's Metaphysical Adventure, where her grandfather is sick in the hospital, dying, and the nurse says, one day science will fix all of this. Remember that? That's really an expression of the confidence of humanist man, that just given enough time, we'll fix everything, we'll understand everything, we will overcome death. That's why, certain people are having their bodies frozen, cryogenics, so that when we've figured out how to overturn death, the principle, and make, they can bring the bodies back to life and continue living. Now, there's all kinds of interesting things going on. And that's not just a scientific pipe dream for them, that is a confidence that eventually we will overcome death. So goodness and capability are at the heart of the humanist view of human beings. And we'll have to return to that in a moment in regard to man's failure. This interesting scene from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's depiction of creation. And in this scene, the person on the right, the gray-haired person, represents God reaching out to touch Adam, the ultimate of creation, and to infuse into him life and all of the qualities of personhood. Here's an interesting takeoff on that from a recent issue of The Economist magazine. And man made life. Not man became a living being, which is what the Scriptures say, but man made life. The first artificial organism and its consequences. And there's a scientific article in regard to the advances that we're making in terms of how to infuse various things with life. And you can see, this is the reversal. This is turning creation on its head. But that is very much the mentality of humanistic man, that we are basically perfectible, that evolution is an upward progress in terms of our ability to understand our nature as physical beings, and to overcome all. So that's humanity from a secular humanist standpoint. Now, just some illustrative cartoons. If evolution were true, this is the aspect I would really be looking forward to. The next stage of evolution is certain to include a built-in wireless remote. Men appreciate that more than women. Women understand it better than men, as they say, click, 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 click. I always have to get up and find that thing, and boy, it would be nice just to have it built in. Just punch, 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 punch. More seriously, where does significance come from in this worldview? Basically, humanity has to establish its own significance. And what we are faced with is the possibility that humanity by itself, humanity as independent, humanity as simply part of the physical creation, is not capable of truly deriving a sense of significance and meaning. And so the question must be asked is ultimately the humanist quest doomed, because as a small speck in the largeness and vastness of the universe, I can't simply yell, I'm significant, and thereby establish absolutely my significance. And we noticed in Christian theism that the idea of meaning and value and purpose are all derived. They're all derived from the fact that we are created by God, that we are related to Him, that He is the one who infuses us with those things. And so this is a problem which must be faced. Now, the humanist is affirming this in rejection of the logical outcome of naturalism, which was what? Nihilism. And saying we can affirm this, which is what existentialism is. But that is the great quest, the great problem, the great issue that the humanist has to come to grips with. The other is summarized in this Opus cartoon. Anyway, this is Pickles. Pickles, a simple chance, couldn't have created a dandelion. Nope, hummingbirds neither, Augie. And it goes on, or butterflies, or rainbows. And this is the whole issue of the intelligent design. And it goes on, there has to be an unseen hand of grace and imagination behind everything. It's called intelligent design. Oh, intelligent design. Which brings up an existential point. Now, Burke Breathitt is not a Christian, but he does understand the issue and the debate of intelligent design. And so he throws this clunker in, which brings up an existential point. Somebody's got some splaining to do. I'll let that soak in for a moment. The issue is intelligent design. Mankind being the height of God's creation as an intelligent designer. And what does this show? Anti-intelligence, right? Bill the cat is cloned and he's a mess. And I don't know what this guy's name is anymore. It used to be, I don't even remember what his name used to be. But he's just, a sot of an individual and not at all what the pinnacle of humanity would be. And Opus, well, Opus is a penguin who thinks he's a human, all right? And that displays anything but intelligent living. And so that is what a secularist would say, well, intelligent design, it's a spoof, it's tongue-in-cheek. But that does introduce the issue, okay, if man is so great, if man is so capable from a humanistic standpoint, why do we find the negative? Why do we find the failure? Why don't we find humanity arriving at where it wants to be, at where the humanist says it can be? And so in every system you have to address the failure, the problems with humanity. And the secular humanist does have a way of approaching that. And so in answering the question, why is man as he is, or what's the nature of man's failure, what's the nature of the hindrance of humanity to overcome the problems that would be called by a theist evil, that certainly are defects in regard to what would be ideal humanity. Every worldview has to deal with that, and the secular humanist has an answer to that. So what's the problem? What's the problem? Well, first of all, the affirmation is sin is not the problem. Sin is not a category for the ethical humanist, for the secular humanist. There can be bad behavior, unacceptable behavior, antisocial behavior, unprofitable behavior, but not to call it sin. Because the minute you introduce the concept of sin, you have to have a standard for that sin, and that opens you up to accepting the idea of a personal holy God. And that, of course, is not within the framework of secular thinking or of humanist thinking. So if the issue is not sin, what is the issue? What is the source of the problems that we find in humanity? And I've given us two tracks here. So remember that naturalism takes one track in regard to this. Secular humanism will take another track. They will become intertwined in popular thinking and in the way things are addressed. But they are a bit separate, well, they are distinctively separate in terms of a philosophical approach. From naturalism, from a standpoint of man simply being the product of blind evolution in a material universe, man's problem results from genetics or psychological conditioning or brain chemistry. Though psychological conditioning very easily slips over into the next column. But it's genetics, it's brain chemistry, it's how I'm wired. And there is a physiological aspect to psychological conditioning, psychosomatic illness and so forth. We know that depression and things that happen in the body can be linked, either a cause and effect, either direction. And so, we've learned enough about how the body works to have evidence that everything somehow is involved, or the physical aspect of man is involved in all kinds of thinking and emotions and so forth. So the doctrine, the dogma of naturalism is every problem, every unacceptable aspect of the behavior of humanity can somehow be traced back to the physical mechanism. Now that would be strict naturalism, which is not what secular humanism follows. But that is one of the tracks. Yeah.
So if naturalism says we're evolving in a positive direction, how do the negative...
It's stuff that we're still overcoming. Okay. Just like, animals had to deal with not being able to get food, and therefore they evolved in order to survive and so forth. So it's the basic position that everything has evolved from simple to complex, and in that evolutionary process, overcoming the negative things that would keep them from surviving.
So the negative was always there.
The negative has always been there, yeah. Now, from a secular humanist standpoint that does not want to rigorously follow the naturalistic everything is a matter of matter, it would be something like ignorance. Ignorance of who or what we are. So it's more of an intellectual, more of a conceptual cause. Or the repression of what we would naturally become by rules and regulations. That we are held from the natural development of into goodness because we have all these negative things put upon us by Christians, by those who have some sort of a religious axe to grind, and come up with all of these things saying we're bad and we can't do this and this and this and this and this. And so these are two of the primary ways that the problems with humanity would be addressed. And of course, there is a crossover here. The secular humanist is not going to say that it's never genetics or it's never brain chemistry, and will resort to that whenever it's convenient or when there seems to be evidence for it. But also going to be more of a conceptual aspect to it. Now, that raises some other kinds of issues and discussions that we're not going to take time to rabbit track into to get into. But basically, that's what it comes down to. So just realize there are kind of two tracks here. They're never completely distinct, and they can be blended together in terms of dealing with this. But it's not sin. It's some kind of conditioning, some kind of negative conditioning. Now the question would be, well, where does negative come from in the negative circumstantial, negative environmental conditioning? And so it's sort of a trail that never has an end, and actually can become a circular argument as well. But that is what the recourse is going to be in explaining behavior. Now, the solution, well, again, from the standpoint of naturalism, the solution would be, behavior modification, genetic engineering, personality-altering drugs, those kinds of sort of enforced external techniques to mold the individual. Now, if you're thinking, you immediately think, oh, okay, now, but who's going to decide what direction to mold? Who's going to decide what you want to mold it into? And doesn't that immediately then introduce an outside authority? And how can a human being be an outside authority? Where does the expertise and the ability and the knowledge come for that? So there are some horns of dilemma that this kind of a thing faces, but this is what you have. Schaefer mentioned in one of the videos Skinnerian behavioralism. That you can condition someone by strictly manipulating their environment. Now we all know that environment does have an impact on how we turn out. The question is it the only impact? Is it a necessary impact? And is it simply a matter of the fact that we're in a physical universe and that it's all external? Genetic engineering, and with our ability to read the genetic code of individuals to find out, what problem in the genes creates this type of a malady and this type of a disease, and eventually this type of thinking and so forth. We can learn to manipulate the genetic code, and we can fix everything. And or drugs, personality-altering drugs. And again, there was illustrations of that in terms of some of the speculative things. We'll just give people anti-aggression tablets, and that will end World War. So you can see how that's a very physical or physiological approach to things that we would call badness or evil or sin. Now, from secular humanism, again, it would be more of a psychological, quasi-spiritual psychological sense. Free the individual from external regulation for the achieving of self-actualization. Because you see, the basic philosophical position is human beings are capable of becoming, ultimate goodness. They just need to be released to do that. They need to be able to get out of the hostile environment. So if we can create the right kind of an environment, people will actualize themselves, will create the good self automatically on their own. And that's a basic faith commitment. Caleb?
Bob Marley was very much like that, secular humanist. And I have a quote on a folder. It says, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds."
None but ourselves can free our minds. Yeah, and that's it. We free our minds from that which enslaves, and in that then we have within us the potential to become what we should become. Now you have to be careful of what you say you're going to become, because good is a term that has some sort of moral, ethical aspect to it. And who defines the good? But that is the basic tenet, that we can become what we're meant to become, what we need to become, what humanity needs us to become. And the second is trust one's deepest desires. And so this is a basic mindset of humanistic man, that deep within us is this positive self that wants to create itself, and that can, if we just have the right conditions. If you get out from under the very bad people who are saying you're bad, you're bad, you're bad, you're sinful, you're sinners, okay, and you can't do good. If we get out from under all of that, then we can really become what we're meant to become. Now this comes out in a lot of interesting ways, particularly in movies, and I think that this will be mentioned in your text, Hollywood Worldviews. But the whole idea of, don't think about this, just trust your heart. Just go with how you feel. You run across any movies where that's the basic idea? Yeah, just trust your heart. Just go with your heart. Just go with what you feel is right. And that's the safest guide. That's the best guide. Don't overanalyze this. Don't think about it. Oh, all your friends are going to come and say this isn't right for this and this and this reason. But if you know it's right in your heart, then go for it, because it's right for you and it'll all work out. And it always does in the movies, right? Well, that's really where that's an expression of this idea that there is within every human being the potential and the capability of the kind of self-actualization, a self-development that will come out given the right circumstances, given the right environment. Now, this really is what was behind the French Revolution, remember? And the other kinds of revolutions from a humanistic standpoint. And, it's the rulers, it's the bourgeoisie, it's the ruling class that are holding down the peons, the proletariat. If you get rid of them, then society is going to transform itself. So they got rid of them, the guillotine. Tens of thousands of people. Did that just automatically transform society? Yeah, into a worse kind of oppression, and they started killing each other as the reason for why we can't get where we want to get. So it was, it was an experiment in this whole thing of change the environment to change the person. If you have to change it violently, you change it violently because ultimately it's for a good reason. But it didn't end up being the key to that, because there's something far more complex going on. Caleb?
So if it's so selfish, why is it called secular humanism?
If it's so selfish.
Yeah, like it's all about you becoming what you think is needed.
Well, humanism is the individual is free and autonomous, and therefore the one who ultimately will direct his or her own course and will become what he or she is meant to become. So it's humanism because at the center of it is the human. Theism, at the center of it is God, who wants for humans what he wants. So, yeah. Yeah.
Both of these are very optimistic about the nature of man.
Extremely optimistic about the nature of man. Naively optimistic about the nature of man is what we would say as theists, because we don't think the problem is repression or rules. We think the problem is an essential evil within the heart of man that God alone can deal with and transform. So, but yeah, get that. It is an extremely optimistic view of man. Not without some evidence, because mankind has done some pretty great things and has overturned some pretty bad situations. Christian and non-Christian man. And Christians have done some pretty bad things, just like non-Christians have done some pretty bad things. So if you look at the evidence from an outside without really looking at revelation, and that's why Schaeffer keeps mentioning you got to go back to what God says in interpretation of it, then you can argue both ways. And you can argue, Christianity isn't in the end run better at transforming whole societies because, look, they've had a chance here and here and here, and it hasn't worked out so good. So you can argue evidence from both sides. And, you can quantify it and you can debate it. But ultimately, it's going to become a matter of information from some source other than ourselves. And so it does become a faith commitment in that regard. Now here's some illustrative cartoons that illustrate this. Again from Bloom County. Here's Milo sitting under a beehive, and Portnoy is looking at the beehive and thinking to himself, this is really interesting. I don't know what happened. This beehive fell down on Milo's head. Milo is musing about things that pertain to that without realizing what's going on. Could it really be that I'm the last one with any faith in humanity? How totally depressing. After all, the last 2,000 years of civilization have been mostly a history of savagery and slaughter. What do you think, Portnoy? Now, Portnoy all this time is trying to knock the beehive down on his head, which is would prove the negative of Milo's thoughts here. Do you think that deep in our hearts we're all basically evil? Now, what's Portnoy's actions that we're aware of that Milo isn't? How has he already answered the question? Yes. But he puts his stick down and he says, nah. Milo says, I'm really relieved. I'm really relieved that there's one other person who feels that humanity is not basically evil, even though in each one of us there's the evidence that it is. And so you do have this, this pull to we're good and pull to goodness, even within fallen humanity. But you have existing as well the clear evidence of humanity's non-good. This is a great cartoon. This is Outland, and we see here Bill the cat. Remember, who's cloned? He was dead from a car accident, and he's been cloned, and he's not quite all there. And it represents the darker side of humanity, of course, in the comic strip. But he says, I tell you, he snuck up on me with a buzz saw and shanghaied my posterior protuberance. I better speak to him. Hold still. So Opus goes to counsel Bill. Bill, it's time we faced your little antisocial problem. I think you should enroll in the Betty Ford Clinic for chainsaw massacres. Many experts consider the desire to assault with tree-cutting equipment a disease. That's a physiological cause. The victims a result of a deprived life, marked by poor social nurturing and physical abuse from schnauzers as children. That's kind of a mixture of all of the physiological and the environmental factors. That's what explains why he does this. At this point, Bill the cat fires up his chainsaw. Their actions a mere cry for help. Saws off his protuberance, runs off, and Opus says, well, then again, maybe they just like it. Maybe it is part of their nature. Maybe it isn't just part of their social nurturing and upbringing, and they're really wanting to get out from that. And it really brings out the dilemma that an ethical humanist would face in regard to this kind of a problem. We'll come back to this as we get ready for the exam and talk about it a little further. Here's another one. Bloom County. Opus is looking into the room there, and he says, "Shh, what's the matter?" "There's a cockroach on the toilet seat." "Well, just stroll right in and squash him." "It's a large cockroach." Opus, 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 letting your petty fears dictate the course of your life again? It's a very large cockroach. Opus, buddy, it's just this sort of mindless fear within some people that many feel has made this country lose nerve and pursue nuclear arms control. Just remember what Francis Bacon once said, "Nothing is terrible but fear itself," which is a misquote of the quote and a misapplication to who quoted it, who said it. Now get in there, ignore your fears, and stand tall. Right. I'd like to share with you a few funny words from Francis Bacon. Are there some problems in life that are bigger than we can handle, no matter how confident we may become to handle them? Yeah. Not the least of which is the problem of the evil that lurks within everybody's heart. All right? So you can redefine it, you can say you can do this, you can handle this, but in the end, is humanity really up to the task as the secular humanist avows that it is? And of course, the Revelation would say no, that can only be encountered with God and His power. Here's another illustrative cartoon. "It's too bad you're not a self-actualizing person, Charlie Brown. Self-actualizing persons are free from fears and inhibitions. They accept themselves and they accept others. They have self-esteem and confidence. Can I become a self-actualizing person? No way. 5 cents, please." Now, in reality, that is sort of what humanism is. There is this concept of self-actualization, but can anybody ever really do it? And can everybody do it? See, that's the thing. It's not, can anybody live, peacefully and happily as a secular humanist? There are many who do. The issue is, can everyone? Does everyone have this ability to think through how to self-actualize and overcome situations? Well, no, everyone doesn't. Now, what's the basis for an ethical system? Again, there is a stance on every one of these fundamental questions in all of the worldviews. The basis of an ethical system is the humanist is free in regard to personal morality. So this is a fundamental dictum that if I'm free, if I'm autonomous as an individual, then in regard to individual choices, I'm free to say yes or no in regard to whether this is right or wrong for me All right? Now, again, you have to handle how you're going to work that out when your actions is interpreted by somebody else as affecting them in a way that's not appropriate. But still at the heart is the freedom, the autonomy to decide morality for ourselves. Secondly, values become relative since changeable humanity is the measure of all things. So what might be right in one situation is not in another, with one group's not another. In one time period, it changes at another time period. Now that's not to say that in a theistic view, world people don't improve and grow in their working out of an absolute ethic. But this is philosophically, things aren't static. Things do change, and you have to expect that. So if it feels right, do it, yeah, but it may feel different tomorrow. You can still do it, because ultimately you're free. Societal values are decided arbitrarily by the majority or some kind of an elite. So they do recognize there have to be some rules, there have to be some acceptable and unacceptable behavior standards, but it's not based upon an absolute God or an absolute morality or even natural law, but it's based upon those who have the formative say in a culture or society. And so it's more groupthink and with the expectation and the trust that, calmer, more noble minds will prevail. And there will be an ethic worked out. Now again, the problem is that, as Schaeffer and others point out, usually the ethical system that is adopted and that works to some degree in every society is one that's borrowed from Christian theism. The sanctity of human life. Where does that come from? It doesn't come from naturalism. Naturalism says, hey, the strongest survive. Survival of the fittest. There's no sanctity in that, but an adopted ethic that's seen to have been part of humanity and works in humanity without the recognition or not admitting that really is borrowed from Christian theism. And it only finds truly an authoritative base in the concept of a personal God. This again is Outland. I figured out what the true... these aren't working. What the true purpose of life is. Want to hear it? I shan't take another breath till I do, Opus says. Being loved and helping others. What can you improve on that? Sounds incomplete. What else is there? Happiness is being loved and helping others and buying a speedboat. No, just being loved and helping others, plus licking the middles of Oreos. Earthly pleasures, they're driving us all to ruin. We should only be living for being loved and helping others. And here comes the pig, I don't know what his name is, gallivanting through the tulips, plus maybe running naked through the autumn bluebells going... So that's what they're doing. Signing off from the road to ruin. What is an ethical life all about? Well, you can argue it, you can debate it. Ultimately, it's personal, and ultimately, it comes to where it's really questionable if it works, if it's going to achieve anything. All right, I told you we were going to cruise here. The nature, meaning of death. What's up ahead? You have to deal with physical death. The secular humanist, death is the end of the individual since all is material. So it's necessarily the end. They are materialists in regard to the principle of life, where life comes from, when life ends. And when life ends, the existence of the individual ends, because the individual is only the material being. The material being accounts for everything. And so when my body stops functioning, that's the end of the person. And that has to be a part of humanism. You can't deny that and still be a humanist. If you deny that, you're either a theist or a New Age pantheist. Okay, so this is a fundamental belief. And while they would say, well, we just certain things we just you don't subscribe to these, you can't get around this one. So the death of the individual. Oh, I forgot that was animated. Man's hope, therefore, is in mankind, not in the individual. So as we read the Humanist Manifesto, there's not a pessimism about death. It's not, well, death is the ultimate absurdity, so let's just go out and do whatever. Be modern hedonists, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. If we're going to die tomorrow, what does it matter what we do? So it's backed away from that. And it has embraced a positive living, living with altruistic motives, living with the purpose of doing good and so forth. But it isn't ultimately defined in terms of personal longevity beyond the grave. But the best that can be hoped for is a quality of life while I'm here that's positive, and then leaving humanity in a better condition because I've been here. So it's really more sort of an evolution of the whole idea. We'll work for the evolution of humanity. Maybe they'll overcome death. I'm not going to overcome death, but I'll live as authentically as I can, and humanity may be saved somehow thereby. So that's the highest that it can go in terms of the philosophical underpinnings.
So essentially you live for yourself to better society?
Yes, yeah. And so you don't live for yourself. And the ethical humanist, the humanist who's tried to think through this, is not going to say, I just don't care about others. And they're going to say the self-actualized life, the best life, is a life that does care about the betterment of others. Now, that's the whole issue. Is there a philosophical base for that in their system? The answer is no. Is there an existential base? Yes, because as you look around and you see people doing that, you know that life is better, and that cultures are better, and that people are better if they give themselves to that kind of a pursuit. So existentially, they can say, we've got evidence that this is the best way to live. But philosophically, they don't, because that does not come out of naturalism. It comes out of theism. And so again, this is where we have to say, well, haven't you really borrowed the basis for ethical action from theism, from the concept of an absolute God? Because this isn't consistent with naturalism. This isn't consistent with us being evolved creatures. It isn't consistent with, with where you're coming from as a base. And this will be the weakness in non-Christian worldviews. Then finally, so the next best thing is for the individual is life extension. Live as long as I can physically. And so the hope in science, the hope in our knowledge, the hope in our understanding of the physical mechanism, and so forth. All right? And we've really anticipated this in most of our comments. So the meaning of history, where's it going to end? Well, history is linear. It's going somewhere. Evolution is an upward progress. They're talking about progress in humanity and progress in the world community and progress in terms of the nobility of human beings. So it's not cyclical like Eastern thought and like New Age is going to be. So they do have an idea that it's purposeful, but history really can't have a purpose because it does not know where it's going. So you see the problem? There really has to be something outside of history to be giving it direction and purpose. So you can only talk about purpose in the sense of the vague idea of the progress of humanity. And again, this is where it becomes fuzzy and where a secular humanist can be challenged to think critically. Does that make sense? Do you have, you have something outside to give direction, to give purpose? So there's nothing outside to give direction, and man isn't the goal because he's part of the machine. How can man be the goal of history If man is just part of the mechanical universe of which history is simply an ongoing flow of events that is not being controlled by any outside force, but is somehow self-guided or unguided, and it just amazingly seems to be happening in a stream, and we can think of past, present, and future. So it ultimately does leave many questions unanswered. Okay, I'm glad you hung with me. We need to get through that material. Someday we have to have an exam. We'll talk about that next. Any questions? You've asked some good questions, and the questions you're asking are the questions that are there to be asked because they're the chinks in the logic of the position. All right? Yes, Amy?
So if you just read the newspaper or look at the statistics of crime and realize that we are not improving as a society, quite the opposite?
Yeah, but all of that is open to interpretation. You can say, yes, there's indications that at least there's areas of society where things aren't improving, and yet look at the great strides we have made. Look at the genetic research, and look at how life is becoming better in these places, and how we do have hope, and the United Nations, and so yes, but it's all interpreted, and it's how you want to weight it and slant it. And again, without some sort of an outside authority to give us the basis for the interpretation, then we're left to ourselves. John?
So, the idea of humanism and the idea of the logical flow of naturalism are almost at war with each other. Basically, the idea that man is personal as opposed to being a machine, and then the problem, naturalism, the physical causes, and the solution are kind of almost like opposite humanism. Like the idea of naturalism, it's to modify people or almost put them in rules, basically more rules, restrict their restrict how they can think, what they can think, but do it internally, like chemically, as opposed to the idea of removing laws.
Well, yeah, I don't know how many things you asked me there or mentioned. There's a dilemma. There's a dilemma that the philosophical base of humanism is naturalism, but not naturalism as it would be logically extended, which is what the nihilist and the absurd movement that you read about in Sire, because then there is no meaning to life, and they saw the natural outcome, but you see that's not livable.
But is it so? It's basically opposing the logical outcome.
No, it's opposing. It's opposing the logical outcome with respect to certain things. Actually, with respect to the heart of what is human, not with respect to everything. So it still says, there's a natural flow, that evolution is going somewhere, that we can see, look back and see how there's been progression. So it's not opposed to that. It's opposed to what naturalism logically does in terms of who and what a human being is. So it's not opposed to everything. It's just opposed primarily to that significant element of what is human. That's where they will take a leap and not follow the logical outcome. But then when it does fit, when things do fit, like solving things medically, solving things physiologically, or solving things emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, they're happy to intermingle the perspective. Yeah. So don't try to completely unconfuse everything, because there is a logical dilemma within the system. All right? They may not like the theistic solution, but at least the theistic solution resolves the dilemma of how there can be good and evil, and how a human being can be both noble and terrible. but because they're free from that, they have to come up with another solution, and that other solution is less acceptable philosophically and logically. So it's not a complete contradiction, but it is a significant contradiction within the system. I think that's what you were getting at.
How do you combat the naturalists and secular humanists when they sound so positive and about life and the nature of man, when you tell them the truth about the evil that's inside of us all?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to everyone listening to the conversation, it's like, you're the bad one. Oh, well, that religion is just a whole bunch of rubbish because all you want to do is be bad, you know?
So how do you deal with the naturalist, the humanist, when he seems to be so more positive, we're so much more negative? Well, what did Francis Schaeffer do? He found some point in their seeking to live life within their viewpoint where they were cheating, where they were protecting themselves from the logical consequences of it. He intellectually helps peel that protection off to where they see that they aren't consistent, and they're really protecting themselves with our viewpoint to help them see the inconsistency in their logic. And just sitting and saying you're bad ain't going to do it. They have, because they're coming at it from a standpoint of a certain perspective and a certain mindset and a philosophy, even though they may not be philosophers or capable of thinking like that, they are still coming from a certain worldview, and they're holding to certain assumed answers to those worldview issues. And so as you get to know the person, as you get to know how they think, and you see that's part of it, is we have to treat them as individuals. Then you can see where the inconsistency is. So for instance, if you were to befriend John Cage, we haven't seen that yet, have we? That video. I won't even bring that up then. You just see that where somebody is living in a way that's inconsistent with worldview. You say, well, why do you do that? That really doesn't fit with what you believe, does it? Well, no. Well, why do you do that? So it would be, graciously yet pointedly helping them face where they are living inconsistent with their own worldview is what Schaeffer's approach would be. And it worked, because he had a tremendous ministry with those who were thinking at the highest level in terms of these kinds of things.